The rest of the world is done waiting for America. This week, trade ministers from Europe and Asia Pacific are meeting in Cameroon to build a global trade alliance, and the United States is not invited. Welcome to Flashpoint, where power shifts before the headlines catch up. To understand what is happening in Cameroon this week, you need to go back to January, to a speech in Davos that went viral and that the Trump administration dismissed as noise. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney stood before the world's most powerful economic gathering and delivered a message that was simple, direct, and deliberately provocative. The middle powers must act together, Carney said, because if we're not at the table, we're on the menu. It was a single sentence. It became a rallying cry. And right now, in Cameroon, on the sidelines of a World Trade Organization gathering, trade ministers from Europe and a group of Asia-Pacific countries are turning that rallying cry into architecture. The meeting this week is not a photo opportunity. It is a working session where ministers are hammering out joint priorities for building a trade alliance that explicitly does not include the United States. The goal, as senior Canadian government officials have described it, is to achieve tangible progress as quickly as possible, not to craft a distant vision, but to deliver concrete results that change how global trade actually functions. The first target is rules of origin, the technical but enormously consequential regulations that determine where a product is considered to have been made and therefore what tariff rate it receives. If the EU and CPTPP nations can harmonize their rules of origin, manufacturers trading between the two blocs would enjoy low tariffs. American manufacturers would not. That is not a side effect. That is the point. Anders Fogh Rasmussen understands this dynamic better than almost anyone. Rasmussen was NATO Secretary General for 4 years. He is a former Prime Minister of Denmark. He has spent his career as one of the most committed advocates for transatlantic partnership and American leadership. And he just returned from a trip to Japan and India where he was promoting his idea for a new trade alliance specifically designed to check the power and influence of the United States. He calls it the D7, a coalition of affluent democracies with overlapping geopolitical interests. During his visit to India, he nudged New Delhi toward joining, suggesting they could simply call it the D8. The man who spent decades championing U.S. leadership is now traveling the world selling an alternative to it. I've seen the United States as a natural leader of the free world, Rasmussen said. But if the United States wants to retire from that role, then others will have to take over. That is not a hostile statement. That is a diagnosis, and it is being acted upon. Subscribe right now because what I'm about to show you is the full scale of what is being built, and why the Trump administration's dismissive reaction may be accelerating it. The alliance taking shape has 2 primary building blocks. The first is the European Union, 27 nations, the world's largest single market, over $17 trillion in combined GDP. The second is the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is the trade deal that emerged from the ruins of the Trans-Pacific Partnership after the United States walked away from it during Trump's first term. The CPTPP includes Australia, Brunei, Chile, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, Vietnam, and the United Kingdom. Together, the EU and CPTPP represent an economic bloc of enormous scale, covering multiple continents, dozens of nations, and trillions of dollars in annual trade flows. Here is the historical irony that makes this moment so significant. The TPP, the original deal that eventually became the CPTPP, was negotiated by the United States. It was a centerpiece of the Obama administration's Asia-Pacific strategy. It was specifically designed to set the rules for Pacific trade before China could do so. Trump withdrew from it on his first day in office during his first term. The deal was renegotiated without America. It came into force without America. And now it is becoming the foundation of a broader trade architecture that is being built specifically in response to Trump's second term, an architecture that does not include America and that will operate by rules America had no hand in writing. Barbara Weissel was the chief U.S. negotiator on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. She watched America walk away from the deal she spent years building. Now she watches the rest of the world using it as the foundation for something larger. Most of the rest of the world believes in global trade rules, believes that they benefit everyone, Weissel said, and they're saying, we are going to assume responsibility for pursuing those global trade rules. That is the shift. For 75 years, the United States wrote the rules of global trade. Not because America was the only country that wanted rules, but because America was willing to lead the process of creating them. Trump has signaled, repeatedly and explicitly, that America is no longer interested in that role, so others are filling it. The Trump administration's reaction to Carney's Davos speech tells you everything about how Washington is reading this situation. The day after the speech, Trump responded directly. Canada gets a lot of freebies from us, by the way, Trump said. Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your statements. It was a response designed to diminish, to frame Carney's vision as the complaint of a dependent, rather than the strategy of a leader. But the response revealed something important. The Trump administration heard the speech, recognized its significance, and chose mockery over engagement. That choice has consequences. Peter Navarro, the White House trade advisor, was asked directly whether the EU CPTPP supergroup effort poses problems for the United States. His answer was revealing. The US shouldn't be worried about that, but it's typical Carney behavior, Navarro said. We've got a problem in Great Britain and Canada with liberal Trump haters. That framing, reducing a geopolitical realignment involving dozens of nations across multiple continents to a personality conflict between Trump and a handful of liberal politicians, is either a deliberate deflection or a genuine misreading of what is happening. Either way, it is not a strategy for addressing it. Navarro did offer one substantive point. He argued that the WTO needs to be overhauled, and that overhauling the WTO is one of the pillars the EU CPTPP supergroup is set to discuss. He suggested Carney should be advocating for WTO reform rather than building parallel structures. But here is the problem with that argument. The United States has been the primary obstacle to WTO reform for years. America blocked the appointment of WTO appellate body judges, effectively paralyzing the dispute resolution system. America imposed tariffs that multiple WTO panels ruled were illegal and then ignored those rulings. The rest of the world did not give up on trade rules. They concluded that trying to reform the WTO with American cooperation was not working and that building alternative structures without American obstruction might be more productive. There is a genuine obstacle to the alliance Carney is building, and Rasmussen identified it directly. I think many governments will be cautious not to too openly provoke the Trump administration, he said. This cautiousness might represent the biggest obstacle to advancing this idea. That caution is real and understandable. Countries that depend on American security guarantees, American markets, or American goodwill have strong incentives to avoid actions that Washington might interpret as hostile. Irish Prime Minister Michael Martin visited Washington last week for his annual St. Patrick's Day visit and delivered a message of partnership and cooperation. When America and Europe work together, we help shape a global economy that is more resilient, more innovative, and more secure. It was a careful balance, maintaining the relationship with Washington while the broader EU CPTPP process moves forward in Cameroon. That balance reflects the fundamental tension in the alliance-building project. The goal, as senior Canadian officials have framed it, is not to craft a future without the United States, but to build a future where these countries are less vulnerable to American unpredictability. The distinction matters. This is not a coalition of countries that have decided America is an adversary. It is a coalition of countries that have decided they cannot afford to be entirely dependent on American reliability. Because American reliability, under the current administration, is not guaranteed. The tariffs that arrived with little warning, the trade agreements dismissed as irrelevant, the withdrawal from international frameworks, these have convinced allies that they need alternatives, not as replacements for the American relationship, but as insurance against its volatility. A senior Canadian government official told reporters that a deal could be done in bits and pieces, with the goal of achieving tangible progress as quickly as possible. Rules of origin is the first target because it is technically complex, but politically achievable. It does not require a full free trade agreement, just harmonization of existing rules. If the EU and CPTPP nations can agree on rules of origin, a manufacturer in Vietnam can sell into the European market, and a manufacturer in Germany can sell into the Japanese market with lower barriers than an American competitor faces. That asymmetry compounds over time. Every year the alliance develops, every deal that gets done in bits and pieces, the gap between countries inside the framework and countries outside it widens. The United States is outside it. Scenario 1. The EU CPTPP initiative produces a limited but real deal on rules of origin within the next 12 months. The deal creates measurable trade advantages for member nations relative to the United States. American exporters begin noticing the disadvantage. Business lobbies pressure the Trump administration to seek inclusion or parallel agreements. The administration, recognizing the competitive threat, shifts toward engagement. A future administration negotiates entry into the CPTPP or a bilateral deal with the EU that partially closes the gap. The damage is real, but manageable. American trade policy eventually adapts to a world where the rules were written without it. Scenario 2. The initiative expands beyond rules of origin into broader trade harmonization. The D7 framework proposed by Rasmussen gains formal structure, with India joining as the D8 and other democracies following. The bloc develops its own dispute resolution mechanisms, its own standards frameworks, and its own investment protection rules, all without American input. By the time the Trump administration recognizes the scale of what has been built, the architecture is too established to easily enter on favorable terms. America spends years negotiating for access to a system it once led, accepting rules it had no hand in writing. Scenario 3. The cautiousness Rasmussen identified proves decisive. Fear of provoking Washington prevents the initiative from moving beyond press releases and preliminary meetings. The rules of origin deal stalls over technical disagreements that reflect deeper political hesitation. Individual countries break ranks to pursue bilateral deals with Washington rather than risk American retaliation. Carney's vision remains a vision. The existing global trade order, fragmented, tariff-heavy, and U.S.-dominated, continues by default. but the damage to American credibility that made the initiative necessary in the first place remains. The world didn't build an alternative, it just stopped trusting the original. Carney said if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. This week in Cameroon, the table is being set, the EU is there, the CPTPP nations are there, the D7 concept is on the agenda. And the United States, the country that built the post-war trade order that negotiated the original TPP that wrote the rules the world has traded by for 75 years, is not in the room. Watch what comes out of Cameroon this week. Watch whether rules of origin talks produce a concrete framework. Watch whether Rasmussen's D7 gains any formal structure. And watch whether the Trump administration's response is engagement or dismissal, because that choice will determine whether America shapes what comes next or simply inherits it. Subscribe to Flashpoint and hit the bell, because in this world, the next move never waits.